Hello, this is a podcast around Celtic forms of healing, early Celtic forms of healing, and some of the issues involved. So this is going to be a combination of sort of historical detail around what very, very little is known about very early Celtic, by which I mean Irish, Welsh, etc., forms of healing, and more of a focus on the sort of medieval stuff that was recorded and written down in various different manuscripts. But also bringing in issues of ethics and issues of philosophies so that we can think about how we understand healing today as well as how it was understood and practiced 1500 or 2000 years ago, as the case may be, to sort of develop ideas and conceptions and knowledge about these various different issues. It is by no means comprehensive because this is a huge subject. It covers a very wide array of issues. So this is just a sort of toe dipping in various areas, and it's going to work in elements of mythology and storytelling and tradition and so on to sort of flesh it out a bit. If we start by thinking of some of the issues around the notion of healing itself, what people in past centuries understood by that, and what we can how we can think about different ways we can think about it today. Fundamentally, you could argue the notion of disease is dis-ease. That's a commonly understood thing these days. Someone whose body is not at ease, it's pained or imbalanced in some shape, form, or guise. And that's an idea you find in throughout medieval Europe when they were using the four humours, which itself tracked back to ancient Greek medicine, which drew on ideas from Egyptian medicine and other sources. It's a common idea in Vedic medicine in India, and in the styles of traditional medicine found in China and other areas around East Asia and so on. So it's a, well, maybe not absolutely global, but it's certainly a very widespread notion of what illness is, and that healing of whatever sort is about trying to restore the ease, trying to restore the balance, trying to get somebody back onto a sort of what should we say, a level playing field. There's obviously more to it than that, but as a basic conception, that's been fairly constant for quite a long time. Where it gets potentially more interesting is in the idea that notions of what exactly constitutes an illness change over time, just as notions of what constitutes a disability change over time. It's not a hard and fast fixed idea. And this brings in an issue. If you are practicing some form of spiritual healing, whether that is anything from, let's say, praying for someone to get better, through to aromatherapy or massage or reflexology or herbalism or something that's a lot more hands-on, and all the things that sort of fit in the middle of that spectrum. To what extent, and I'm not going to answer this question, I'm going to do the usual annoying lecturer thing and pose a question and leave you to think of the answer yourself, but to what extent does the patients or the clients, whatever term you want to refer to them by, to what extent does their definition of illness matter? In that, if we think that, say, doctors in the 1950s, for argument's sake, had very high status, they were very well respected. Generally speaking, if the doctor said to somebody, Mrs. Jones, you have so-and-so illness and you need to take these pills, then 9 times out of 10, Mrs. Jones says, yes, doctor, thank you very much, doctor, and probably took the pills. Possibly tipped some of them down the toilet, but by and large took the pills, because there was a degree of trust in the sort of the authority and the knowledge and the insight of the medical expert to be more important than the understanding of the patient and their self-awareness of their own health. These days it's quite different. An awful lot of doctors get people coming into their surgeries saying, oh, I've Googled my symptoms, and I've looked at this, that and the other website, and here's a load of print-offs. I think I've got this. What are you going to do about it? So rather than trusting to the doctor's expertise, they are engaging in self-diagnosis. which I imagine possibly gets quite annoying for a lot of doctors who think, why did I go to medical school for 7 years if you spend 7 minutes on Google and think you know more about medicine and health than I do? But, some people genuinely have found information which was unknown to the doctor, maybe cutting edge stuff and things like that, or occasionally spot things that the doctor is too pressured, too hassled to spot, especially these days when you've got the interview with the doctor is squeezed down to a matter of a few minutes on the conveyor belt that various regionally incompetent governments have reduced the NHS to. So it's not an entirely bad thing, but clearly it must get somewhat annoying for someone who perceives themselves as a medical expert, and well, it doesn't just perceive themselves, they are a medical expert. As a former spiritual healer of some description or another, are you? Let's not say a medical expert, because clearly there's a massive amount of difference between someone who lights candles and dances around them and prays for a person to get better, and someone who's gone to medical school for 7 years. I mean, there's a massive difference in knowledge. But perhaps you're, say, an aromatherapist or a reflexologist or something, and you have 5 years, 10 years, however many years experience of doing that. You've gained some understanding of anatomy and health issues and signs and symptoms to look out for. You have some degree of expertise in understanding. It's your job, if you like, to elicit information from the client and offer them a suggestion as to what's probably wrong with them, and then recommend various forms of treatment. Usually, not always, but usually informed by an actual medical diagnosis from a doctor who's told this patient what it is that they've got. So it's not you giving the diagnosis per se, but building upon and adding a spiritual dimension to a pre-existing scientific diagnosis of what is wrong with the individual. But there may also be occasions when someone is coming to you with no specific biological illness, but perhaps they're suffering mental stress, grief, anxiety, all sorts of psychological issues, and there is a degree of diagnostics going on there in terms of deciding what's wrong with this individual, how to help them, and so forth. What I'm getting at is not so much this idea that they're going to turn up with half a dozen pages printed off the internet saying, I've got this and you've got to help me, but rather that there are conditions that have been at some point in the past considered illnesses, which are no longer considered illnesses. In fact, we wouldn't even call them conditions in this day and age. So things that were medical conditions once, which are now understood in some very different light. So an extremely obvious example on that one is homosexuality. Up until fairly recently, and we're only talking a few years ago when all is said and done, many doctors considered being gay, or well, homosexual as they would have said then, as a mental illness. There are still people in the world who regard it as a mental illness, so it's not a thing of the past entirely. But the majority of doctors in this country do not regard it as a mental illness anymore, and therefore wouldn't say, oh, you've got homosexuality, and you need this, that, the other treatment for it. It's no longer thought of in that way, quite clearly. Being just plug this in. Being transgendered used to, until extremely recently, be a psychiatric diagnostic label of gender dysphoria as a form of mental illness. That has recently been dropped. So somebody can be in a very odd position where on Monday they are classed as being psychiatrically ill, and by Wednesday they're not anymore. Even though their lifestyle, the state of their mind and so forth, has not changed one iota. It's the labelling that has changed. And that's quite odd and quite strange. If doctors, psychiatrists, various forms of medical health professional, if they can change labels, today this is an illness, tomorrow it isn't an illness, what role does a person's self-perception play? So do you as a healer require them to say, I have XYZ going on in my life, I see it as an illness, I want you to treat me? Or equally, they might say, I've got XYZ going on in my life. You're sitting there thinking, well, that sounds like an illness to me. But they, the client or the patient, whatever word you want to use, turn around and say, well, I don't think of it as an illness. I'm perfectly happy with this. I don't want to change it. Is it down to you to convince them that they have an illness? The two examples I've just given of homosexuality and transgender are quite sort of topical, very liberal things that the majority of people who consider themselves open-minded and liberal are reasonably okay on most of the time. But supposing it's something that many people would not be okay on. So supposing you've got somebody who might face a medical diagnosis, psychiatric diagnosis of antisocial personality disorder, what used to be called psychopathy a few years back, because they really enjoy torturing puppies, for argument's sake. And they come to you and say, well, I do this, and you're sitting there, alarm bells going off all over the place, thinking, you need some kind of treatment or something to address this behaviour. But they say, I'm perfectly happy I like doing this, it's fun, it's a hobby, there's nothing wrong with me. If you think it's wrong, that's your problem, mush, that's not my problem. Obviously, as if you're a reflexologist, you can't exactly section them on the basis of your diagnosis. It requires more medical expertise than that. But there is an extent to which you might look at somebody else's behaviour, whether they're coming to you as a patient or whether it's just the person who lives next door and you're listening to them and thinking, you really need help, where you perceive something as a serious issue that requires healing, but the person in question does not. Is there, what should we say, self-diagnosis, if we can call it that, is that something which trumps your view as a person with a degree of healing or medical knowledge, understanding, expertise? So if they say it's not an illness, do people within the healing world say, oh, fair enough, you go on torturing those puppies, you're perfectly happy doing that, it's not an illness? Or are there occasions when people have to say, well, just because you don't think it is, it still is. Your denial, your refusal to perceive this as an illness is your misunderstanding, not something that should affect my view as a person offering some form of healing, therapeutic, medical, whatever type of service. Something to mull over, because there may be situations that you potentially might face if you're in any position to extend the hand of healing, where either you feel that this person needs help for something that they really don't think they need help for, and you've got to decide whether to back off, whether to sort of push ahead and say, actually, you really need to reconsider your self-understanding here. Or conversely, there may be situations in which that person thinks they have a serious illness that needs healing for, and they've come to you to say, well, will you do something for me? But you're thinking, this isn't an illness. So, for example, what if you have, returning to an earlier example, someone who is a devout Catholic or a devout Muslim who comes to you and says, I have all these gay things in my head, all these images in my head, and I am possessed by evil influences or mental illnesses, however they want to define it. I want you to cleanse me, purge me, cure me of this state of mind. A GP, a respectable GP, would have to say, well, it's no longer considered an illness. I can't do anything about this. I could recommend you to see a therapist who will help you come to terms with yourself the way you are, but I cannot, in good conscience, recommend you to see some quack therapist who will claim to cure you and make you straight. That's the standard response for medical professionals. If you're a spiritual healer, you're not held to the same standards as medical professionals. And it doesn't have to be the gay example, it could be all sorts of things that a person might consider to be wrong with themselves that you, as the provider of therapy, have no issue with, and you don't understand why this person has such a sort of angst about issues. Do you say, well, all right, I will help you to an extent? Or do you say, well, I'll try and help you overcome the feelings of anxiety and guilt and this and that and the other, but your fundamental issue is not going to change because it's not a problem and it's just your neurosis, your social conditioning, or however you want to phrase it. That's the problem, not the behavioural issue that you want to change. That's something you've got to make a kind of a judgment call about. And there is this element to which illnesses can be understood as not a fully objective thing, but in some senses a sort of social phenomena where the person with the condition and the person doing the diagnosing and the recommending and the labelling come together in an agreement on what is or is not unhealthy and what can or cannot be treated and so forth. So there's got to be some degree of bringing together on that. But that's a sort of philosophical issue, and we'll move more into the historical side of things. In terms of very early history, very little is known, as with most of these things. There are some interesting archaeological evidences. So, for example, in Colchester in Essex, a grave from the early Romano-British period was unearthed a few years back. It's commonly referred to as the Druid's grave, although there's no kind of carved stone in the grave saying, "I was a Druid." So that's more of an interpretation, and some people challenge that. But the person in the grave, there's all sorts of things buried in the grave with them, including a set of medical instruments. And it's the medical instruments that have largely led to this labelling the Druid's grave, because the idea of Druids as doctors and healers and so forth. These are metal instruments, scalpels and things used in trepanning, and there's a whole kind of set of these tools. And they are so well designed that even a couple of thousand years down the line, the modern day version of those tools, in almost every case, is pretty much the same. The medical technology has not improved upon the design, because that design was just so good. And the assumption is that the man in the grave was a surgeon, and when he died of whatever he died of, his equipment, his tools, which must have cost an absolute fortune. I mean, they must have been real kind of high-end deluxe objects for a surgeon to have. They were rolled up in a leather container and placed in the grave with him. Perhaps whoever became the next doctor for the community had their own tools, or they had to go and buy their own tools, or what have you. But it's interesting, partly, that they weren't passed on to another living doctor, but also the sheer quality, the sheer standard, what this tells us about the level of medical insight and surgical understanding at that time makes it really quite impressive. And so we're looking at a body of people, even back a couple of thousand years ago, who had attained a level of knowledge that must have taken generations to build up. So it's unlikely that this one doctor in his own lifetime suddenly designed all these tools out of thin air. More likely that these were tools which earlier versions had been tried and changed and developed and adapted and evolved, until by the time of this man's death, they had attained this standard of quality. So this is a representative of many, many generations worth of surgical and medical knowledge and understanding. And we do have stories which fit well with that. So in Ireland, going across the waves, there's the story of Druid, the god of surgery, the god of medicine, who the story doesn't go into the tools he uses, it just sort of talks about what he does rather than how he does it. But he's able, for example, to conduct a very curious form of transplant, in that there's a night watchman, a guard on the towers, as it were, who loses an eye in an accident. And Druid comes along and removes an eye from a cat and puts it in the socket of the injured man, and it sort of fuses into his head, as it were. It's not just a decaying dead organ, it's sort of patched in with nerve endings and blood supply and everything else, and so it continues to live. But there's a sort of a humour in the story, in that when this guy is trying to fall asleep, the cat's eye, every time a mouse scurries by, the cat's eye opens up and sort of wakes him up and chases the scurrying of mice. But this idea of organ transplanting, obviously, unless you're going to go into some weird conspiracy theory of alien tech, it's clear that people in the Iron Age could not transplant animal organs into human bodies. I mean, you couldn't transplant a cat's eye into a human body and get it to adapt today. with 21st century medical science, let alone going back a couple of thousand years. But even the fact that they could consider it as a possibility is fascinating. So even though it would have been a sort of a hypothetical possibility for them at the time, it's like kind of a fantasy thing, the fact that they thought, can you take an organ from one body and put it into another body and it still live and it take on the functions of the missing organ from the patient's body? And they were thinking in terms of these sorts of medical concepts and issues. That is highly suggestive that maybe people had tried, they'd experimented. Obviously it hadn't worked because they didn't have the technology for it, but perhaps they'd looked at the possibility. Maybe someone had had a go at stitching an arm off a wounded soldier on a battlefield from one soldier to another soldier, or something like that. They'd engaged in possibilities and experiments. We've also got the story of Miach, the son of Janchecht, who, like his dad, is a great healer and a great surgeon, in fact, possibly even greater. There's a contention there. Nuatha, the king of the Tuatha De Danann, loses his, well, the word used can mean either hand or arm. And so there's this ambiguity. Is it just his hand that gets chopped off, or is it the whole arm that gets chopped off? But the oddities of language aside, he loses part of an arm. And Janchecht finds it and preserves it in herbs and whatnot, sort of sticks it in a Tupperware box under the bed or whatever, and preserves this limb. And attaches to Nuatha a fully functioning mobile metal arm made of silver, what is basically a prosthetic limb, a robot arm. Now, wooden legs are something that have been in existence for quite a long time. It's just that kind of sawn-off furniture stump thing that we associate with pirates. But the idea of a functioning artificial limb is way, way, way ahead of its time, just like the transplant of the cat's eye is way, way ahead of its time. So again, even though they couldn't do it, the fact that they had considered and imagined and envisioned the possibility of it is very impressive and very suggestive. And we're nowadays at the point where, well, not in terms of silver arms, but in terms of plastic prosthetic arms with robotic implants where the fingers can be made to move by the nerve endings in the stump, that kind of thing. All of that is now viable. There are people with these sort of robot arms, robot legs that function and work quite efficiently. And no doubt 100 years from now, if society is still chugging on, then the arms of the future and the legs and what have you of the future will be even more advanced and sophisticated and refined than the ones of today. But again, they were thinking about this thousands of years ago, which is really quite fascinating. The son, Miach, a couple of years down the line, finds the arm in the Tupperware box under the bed and says, well, actually, I can go one better than that robot arm. And he takes the robot arm off. The story doesn't say what happens to it, whether they just melt it down or whether it scurries around like Thing in the Addams Family or whatever. That would make a good story. Anyway, the arm is the flesh arm is taken out of the box and reattached. It's obviously it's not withered up to a manky bit of old shriveled leather or decayed to bone. It's still fully preserved, and he's able to sort of stitch it back on. And there's a spell which is recited in the story of sinew to sinew and bone to bone and vein to vein that he recites as he is sewing this arm back on. And when he's finished and he's done his magic and whatnot, the arm is completely back, is completely where it needs to be, or hand as the case may be, is completely back where it needs to be, and it's working and it's functioning, and it is the reattachment of a severed limb, which is something that couldn't be done until very recently in medicine. And we are talking, only a few decades ago that a hand or an arm or a foot or whatever could be stitched back onto the body, and all the veins and the nerves and so on. Say glue together, that's not quite right, is it? But reattached for that limb to be usable again, fully usable again. So once again, we've got this sort of stories that are predictive of medical techniques that were way ahead of their time, way in the future. And it suggests that maybe their understanding of how bodies worked and possibilities and options was really very, very impressive. And this sort of knowledge, as per the Druid's grave in Colchester, would have been the preserve of the Druids if we go back pre-Roman invasion. And one of the ambiguities of naming that Colchester grave, the Druid's grave, is it can't be said with absolute certainty that that man might not have been from some other part of the Roman Empire, a doctor from some other part of the world who'd come in to live in this country. So can it be said with absolute certainty he was a Druid? Well, no, but it is highly suggestive. There are other archaeological remains. For example, in Ireland, there's lots of examples of the Tialush. The Tialush were stone buildings, and quite small. There's sort of think something more like a shed, really, in terms of size and scale. A lot of them were beehive shaped, much like the monastic cells that became very popular under Christianity. But the Tialush was a place of healing. It is sometimes referred to in modern times by modern day authors as a sweat lodge, which is a bit unfortunate because the sweat lodge is a very specific thing from Native American culture, and it doesn't quite translate. So it's the way it's used in America is not the way it was being used in Ireland. So it's not a comfortable translation of the term. But it was basically a stone-built hut in which be a container of water in the middle, and they'd heat up rocks on a fire that was outside the hut. So, and then someone very carefully, I assume, and probably using a little shovel or whatever, would bring the hot rocks in and drop them in the bowl of water, which would then bubble and steam, and there'd be herbs and things in the water. And it was mainly used for the elderly with rheumatism and arthritis. So they would sit in what was more like a kind of a Swedish sauna, really, than a Native American sweat lodge, because they weren't going in there to have mystic visions or anything of that sort. They were going in there for the heat and the healing properties of the herbs to ease their aches and pains and their joints. When I say elderly, the age groups we're talking of these days would be, people in their 30s and 40s, because a very, very hard life, tilling the fields out in all weathers, no central heating, your body would get haggard very quickly in life. And so if you live to be 40, you would look a bloody sight older than most people look these days at 40, because your body would be very worn. And arthritis would set in that much earlier because of being out in the fields, all weathers and so forth. So we're not talking like 90-year-olds, we are talking a much younger age group, really. But people needing medical treatment for their aches and their pains. And as a technique, it remained in practice for a long time in Ireland before they fell out of use. And so the stone buildings, or what's left of them, from ancient times and through medieval periods can still be found in Ireland. And then that's the technique that could be recreated in this day and age, whether I suppose it's a bit ambitious to go and build a stone lodge. You could just have a sauna and use healing herbs in the water that's being heated up into steam, something like that, and create that as a technique. Whether you did it for aching bones or whether you wanted to try and use herbs that might induce a sort of hallucinogenic state for visionary experiences, up to you. There's all sorts of other traditions that we could briefly mention. For example, there's this book, The Physicians of the Medvay, which is a Welsh book about a family of doctors where father, the grandfather, the great-grandfather, right, back to the year dot, are all doctors. And this very famous family in the Medvay who are all multi-generations of doctors, passing on their knowledge, passing on their books of medicine, passing on all of their techniques well into the medieval period and later. And a combination of herbalism, of surgical techniques, of spellcraft, all of them interwoven each into the other, and that spellcraft drawing in Christian saints and the Virgin Mary and Jesus and so on, but also lots of fairies and folkloric beings, and that fusion of sort of pagan imagery and Christian imagery and scientific practice coming together as a sort of a three-way force, so that there is no. Whereas these days we would distinguish between a scientific medical practitioner and a spiritual healer as two quite distinct things. at this point in history, when the physicians were around, there was no real distinction between those things. They all interwove. And certainly by this time, medical practice was passed down within the family. There is a suggestion that when we look at things like the Neches and the earlier books that deal with careers and the sort of knowledge people must have at different levels and stages of their career, the skills they must have, kind of fees they charge. Some of it is almost like a sort of a trades union handbook in a way. People could become doctors because they showed talent. So they would become an apprentice, like a medical student, as it were, and study under doctors. So rather than necessarily always passing father to son or mother to daughter or what have you within a family, it could bring in people who were unrelated but who showed talent. And so these were more like, just as you could become apprentice to a blacksmith or apprentice to a carpenter, so you could become apprentice to a physician and learn the trade and one day go off on your own. Maybe move to a different village or whatever and set up practice there. And going back further, again, as I said earlier, these were skills under the remits of the Druids rather than the more kind of secularized practice that became in later society after the dominance of Christianity. Even later on into the Victorian period, we have this book, the Carmina Gadelica, which was collected by Alexander Carmichael. He went around the Highlands and Islands of Scotland talking to all these crofters and little old ladies and little old men and fishermen and people who get off the sheep and one thing and another, and interviewed them about their songs, their prayers, their folklore, a whole raft of stuff, and wrote it down. And this is a wonderful book, full of poems and songs, things that they would sing. Almost everything they did there was a song for. So a song to sing when you're churning the butter, and a song to sing when you're in the boat pulling in the fishing nets, and a song to sing when you're healing people, all that kind of thing. And it's full of folklore. There is some degree to which he may have tidied up some of the things that people told him. So it may not be all of it absolutely word for word what these people in the Highlands and Islands told him. May have polished some of it a bit. But predominantly it is those sorts of techniques, and it includes a lot of the ora, healing spells, healing charms, prayers, again a fusion of Christian imagery and pagan imagery, coming together and combining things like herbalism, but also a prayer or a chant that has to be sung over the herbs while you're grinding them, or the poultice whilst you're spreading it on someone's chest. And it's this fusion, much as with the physicians, it's this fusion of ritual and religion from two sources, and more overtly scientific practices like the herbalism and the setting of bones and all this kind of thing. How much of that you'd want to bring into a modern day context, and most of the conditions that are being treated in the Carmina Gadelica are stuff you'd go to your GP for. So how, at one level, it's curious as a sort of a museum piece, as an example of a culture pretty much gone. But is it an inspiration for things you can do now? Well, I suppose if you were coming from a more Druid stance, you wanted to make your healing techniques more Druidic. Let's say I've got a qualified masser. If I were massaging someone, well, I can't actually sing because I can't hold a tune, but if I could, maybe I could do both the hands on the massage, but also reciting, singing the sort of poetry and prayers and things like that over the person's body to heal their aching muscles, or if they're stressed, to relax them or whatever. If I sung at someone, it really wouldn't be relaxing. There'd be fingers in ears and running out of the room, but you get the point. Then there might be ways you could combine these concepts into modern day practice, rather than just seeing it as an entirely dated historical thing. What else is worth mentioning? Oh yes, I've got a few notes. Throin flower, the peace and the truth, well, more truth than peace, the truth of the Lord, not the Lord as in the Lord God, but the Lord of the manor, the local king or chieftain or whatever, or lady of the manor as the case may be. This idea that's persistent in ancient Irish, in Welsh, in Arthurian, in a number of different insular Celtic sources, and other sources too, that if you have a decent monarch, chieftain, political leader, whatever you want to call them, lord or lady of the manor, if they're a good, decent, upstanding person who has truth in their hearts and makes wise decisions and judgments and leads the people well, that will be reflected in the land. So you'll get good crops, good harvest, your cattle will always have plenty of calves, and the sheep will have plenty of lambs, the chickens will lay lots of eggs, and the population will be healthy. So it doesn't mean no one gets a cough or a cold, simply that there's no plague sweeping the land, there's no major illnesses or anything like that. The health of the people is maintained by the quality of rulership of whoever it is that's in charge of the show. And if you do get famines and plagues and natural disasters and all manner of problems, that is a sign that you have a really crap leader that the gods, the spirits of the land, do not approve of. And they are expressing their displeasure with this leader through creating these problems. And so the cure is to get shot of your leader, get a better leader. You don't have to necessarily kill the existing leader, although I'm sure there were occasions when people really thought about that one. But just depose them, give them the boot, show them the door, bring somebody better in. I say this on the day when Boris Johnson has just become PM, but we'll see how that one pans out. You could make an argument, let's try not to get too political and too bogged down in personalities, but if you have a leader in modern times who makes really bad decisions about public health and the way money is spent on the NHS and on health education campaigns and all this sort of business, then that will take its toll on the health of the population. So their bad decisions will lead to more people getting ill, just as their good decisions might lead to fewer people getting ill. Or that ones who do get ill recover more quickly because the hospitals are well funded, there's plenty of nurses, plenty of doctors, plenty of dentists, blah, blah, blah. The resources are spent wisely, so you don't necessarily have to see this in an entirely metaphysical, mystical, magical way. You can see that public health is quite heavily related to the sorts of decisions made by whoever's in charge of spending the money. What do they invest in? What do they not bother investing in? Or what do they cut back on? Or that kind of business. So austerity impacts public health in a bad way. Can sometimes impact public health in a good way. Decisions made about cutting back on sugary, fatty foods would have a benefit to public health. So sometimes it can go in a positive way, but frequently in a negative way. And wise decisions benefit the public health. So you can see how that sort of pans out into a very practical political way, as well as in terms of the more metaphysical. And you think about decisions made around agriculture, decisions made around road building, decisions made around water pollution, impact the land and the health of the land, lead to good crops or bad crops, lead to flooding in heavy rains, or no flooding because there's plenty of trees to suck up the water when it comes bucketing down from the sky. And so whether someone's house gets flooded or not partly is down to idiocies of building on floodplains, but it's also down to things like deforestation and indiscriminate house building, and all kinds of things that ultimately track back to decisions made by people in power. Whether that is the Prime Minister of the whole country or the head of the local council, whatever level that decision has been made at, someone's probably made really rubbish decisions, and there is a consequence for the land, and therefore for the people living on the land. It makes sense. And it also puts health into a more public sense, kind of shading into sociology here. That our health is not entirely confined to ourselves and our bodies and our own private decisions, but big-scale decisions made by political leaders, the views of the General Medical Council, these kind of big grandiose issues have an effect on the day-to-day health of ordinary individual people. Sometimes a very bad effect and sometimes a very good effect. But it's understanding that our health fits into a bigger context, and that healing isn't just a matter of here's a pill, take it, now go away. Good health can necessitate changes. So if someone has got, changes in social policy, I should say, lifted off there. Someone has got tuberculosis from living in a really damp, squalid, shitty, awful house. You can medically treat the tuberculosis in a hospital, but if when they leave hospital they go right back to living in that manky, wet, damp house, the problem's going to start again. Their cure is both the treatment of the tuberculosis, but also moving them to a dry house, and maybe instituting policies that landlords have a responsibility not to let their properties get rank and damp and all sorts of problems that's going to really seriously affect the health of their tenants. There's all sorts of big decisions that are affecting that individual person's health, for good or for ill, as well as their own personal choices, their own small-scale choices. And so health can be understood both at the small scale, but also at the big grand scale. And as a healer, well, you probably fit at more the small scale, but you can give advice, even if you can't do much of anything to change the policies at the big scale. You can at least suggest to this person who's unwell in front of you. You do realise that what would be useful is you writing a million letters to your MP about this and getting that law changed so that you're no longer living in a wet house and blah, 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 blah. Kind of change the grander issues that are at play. Why are so many people suffering mental illness and stress? There's all sorts of big grand issues at that, as well as individual things like miserable relationships or whatever that might be affecting them at a more personal scale. It's seeing that balance between the big and the little. You also have a variety of deities associated with healing. We've mentioned them quite a few times over the years and previous podcasts and what have you. Brige in Ireland, there's the threefold sisters, the goddess of poetry, the goddess of blacksmithing, and the goddess of healing. The fires of healing that cleanse and purify and burn away the dross of illness, release that person and restore them to health. Ganchecht, we've already mentioned, is a god connected to surgery. Miach, his son, is also connected to surgery. And the daughter, Miach's sister, Emij, is connected to healing herbs. When her brother dies at the hands of his own father, because they're having an argument about Miach's wish to restore the dead to life, which Ganchecht is fully against and says this is just terrible. If humans could just come back from the dead willy-nilly, the world will go to hell in a handbasket, and they have a huge round eventually. The father kills the son. From the grave, from Miach's grave, they grow 365 herbs, and his sister comes along and lays her cloak out next to the grave on the grass, and she plucks each herb and she puts it on the part of the cloak which would match up to the bit of the body that herb treats. So one herb for every day of the year, each one treating a different part of the body and a different ailment associated with that part of the body. Her father, Ganchecht, gets quite marked and says, hang on, you're not bringing the dead back, but you're giving way too much knowledge to humans who will feel themselves to be like gods. They'll become very arrogant and overbearing and not take proper care of themselves. If they have all of this medical knowledge, they'll get a bit silly. He kicks the cloak, so the herbs go everywhere, and the knowledge is lost. She has the knowledge, but only she has the knowledge. Nobody else can come along and look at the cloak and get that knowledge. So she goes off and she travels the world and she teaches people in secret. That becomes the secret knowledge of the herb life, which is a practice that continued until very, very recently in European in general history, that herbal knowledge of treating everyday minor ailments was often the preserve of the wife, the mother of the house. And daughters would learn from their mothers or from their grandmothers, from their aunts, who would pass on treatments for toothache and hemorrhoids and sore feet and headaches. And we're not talking surgery and arms hanging half off and things like that, but minor everyday ailments were the province of the herb wives. and the knowledge of herbs and how to grow the herbs or where to find them growing wild and all that kind of thing. Well, there's a very strong tradition of that being passed down. And there are quite a number of herbal books available out there today, detailing at least some, not all, but at least some of that knowledge, which has kind of re-emerged. It is easy to romanticise some of that knowledge and get carried away with what philosophers call the fallacy of nature, that this idea that because something is organic, it must be better than something that is synthetic. It can be, but not always. You can point out that yew seeds are very, very organic, but if you eat them, it'll be the last bloody thing you ever do. So just because something is organic and natural is an automatic guarantee that it is better. One of the reasons why we synthesize medicine, I mean, there's all sorts of reasons, but one of the reasons is that you can control dosage. If your treatment involves a mixture of parsley and rosemary or whatever, one spoonful of parsley or a couple of twigs of rosemary will have a different chemical relation than the next, ratio rather, not relation, in terms of the active chemicals that are treating the illness a person is suffering from. So you can't guarantee giving a person 2 doses of dose today, a dose tomorrow. They're not going to get exactly the same dose each time. Whereas if it's a pill churned out in a factory, every single pill has precisely the same dosage in it. Therefore, dosage can be controlled very, very tightly. In synthetic medicines, it cannot be controlled tightly in herbal medicines, which is an issue people need to take into account. Swings and roundabouts, you gain, you lose. What else did I want to mention? Nodens is another deity. The British name Nodens becomes Matha in Ireland, the father of Gwyn ap Neath, the fairy god of the wild hunt, in Wales and very strong in Cornwall as well, other parts of the country. Much associated with healing. His temple at Libni had sleeping chambers built around it, so people with various illnesses would go along and would pray and probably light incense, what have you, for help and advice. And they would bring little clay or wooden objects of the part of their body that was injured or unwell. So if you had a manky foot, you'd bring along a little wooden foot, or if you're losing your sight, you'd bring along a little clay eyeball. And part of the offering, having said your prayers and whatnot, was to put the offering into water, this little clay or wooden object, and then go and sleep in one of these little stone chambers, in the conviction that during the night they would have dreams. And in these dreams, if dogs turned up, the dogs of Nodens, and licked them or woofed at them or whatever, that was a sign, an omen that they would get better, because the dogs were the messengers of the god. If they didn't dream of the dogs, or if the dog came and bit their arse or something, then that was a sign that they were not going to get any better, and that the god was not willing, for whatever reason, to provide them with healing. So the prophetic nature of the dream was an omen as to recovery or failure to recover. We could go into all sorts of reasons of connection with dogs and healing, and canine saliva, and stroking dogs reduces heart rate and stress and slows you down, and is very calming and soothing and all sorts of things. But that's a whole other subject, and we'll leave that to one side. I think to finish on, because otherwise this is going to go on forever, isn't it? If we just briefly mention the wasting sickness of Cuchulainn, the Ulster warrior, the great warrior of Ireland, the province of Ulster. At one point, Cuchulainn, there's loads of stories about him, but in one of these stories, it is all the lords and the ladies of the court are off on a jolly, off on a picnic, and there's this huge flock of birds with amazingly beautiful, brightly coloured feathers. And one of the ladies of the court goes, wouldn't it be lovely to have some of those feathers in my hat? And a bit like those kind of Victorian women who had emu plumes and things in their hats. And so Cuchulainn and a couple of the other blokes, being very testosterone, and go, we'll get you some feathers, don't you worry, love, except with an Irish accent. And off they go, and with the bow and the arrow, they bring down a number of these birds, and pluck them and what have you. The birds are magical birds, they're fairy birds. In fact, they are fairies in the shape of birds. They are the people of the sheep, and they are pretty pissed off, to be honest, at being treated in this shoddy way of being killed off and attacked, just so some dozy trout can have a few feathers in her hat. And they curse Cuchulainn as the kind of primary instigator of the hunt. And two of the birds are fairy women, and they come and visit him in dreams, a whole year's worth of dreams. And in the dream, they beat him with sticks, and he's sort of lying there going, as they're bashing Seven Shades of shit out of him in the dreams. And when he wakes up, he feels the bruises and the welts, and he sort of feels haggard and awful and tired, and he can't eat, and he can't drink, and he can't sleep properly during the day. He can't rest because his sleep is always tormented by these nightmares. And over the course of a year, he gets iller and iller and iller and iller, and he's at death's door. And eventually they have to try and resort to various techniques to help him. And the fairy women make bargains as to, I won't go into all the ins and outs because it's a whole story in itself, but eventually he gets cured by winning the sympathy of the fairy women who he has offended and kind of making amends to them, amongst other things. But this idea of tormenting dreams, of illness being caused by the fairies, because you've done something to upset them and they are eking their vengeance on you through the infliction of disease. You get that in Scandinavian culture, in Anglo-Saxon culture, in Polish and Latvian, Lithuanian and Russian, and I mean, you name it, pretty much everywhere. This idea that the beings of the woods and the beings of the mountains and the beings of the streams and what have you, if you offend them and annoy them and attack them and do horrible things to them, they will do horrible things to you. And part of the horrible things they do is common phrase is elf shot, elf arrows, that they kind of twang one of their magic arrows at you. When it hits, it causes an illness and you get ill as a result of upsetting the beings around you. Many cultures to this day, even within Islam, within Christianity, the idea of demons or the jinn and various other things, there are beings in the world who, if they take against you, will make you ill, will drive you insane. And part of the healing ritual is not just pills and medication and what have you, but to address the spiritual problem, the spiritual malaise, which could be an exorcism to drive the spirit away in some cultures, or, as per the Irish example of that myth, trying to make amends to the being who's been offended, to say, if I do this for you, please leave me alone and to let me get better. And so bargaining takes place for health. And obviously, an awful lot of the majority of doctors and nurses would say that's a lot of rubbish these days, and I wouldn't believe in that at all. But many cultures do believe in it quite ardently, quite passionately. And it becomes part of the healing routine to say, who have you annoyed? Whose toes have you stumped on that they have inflicted this illness upon you? What can be done either to banish that spirit or to make amends to that spirit, as the case may be, that they will then leave you in peace and your health will start to restore itself. You begin to recover from either the mental illness and the tormenting dreams and all the rest of it, or physical illness, as the case may be. Is that something to consider in modern day Druidry? Many Druids believe that we are not humans, the only sapient being on the planet. There are many other things around us, and some of these things can harm if they wish to. If they're annoyed or upset or encroached upon or whatever, is it worth saying to an unwell person, what have you done? Who have you upset? Or is that just heaping guilt and blame and misdirection on someone who's got enough problems already? I mean, that's, again, a question which I won't even bother answering because I'll leave it to you to think for you, come to your own conclusions. As to the extent to which non-human entities can have an influence upon creating illness in the first place, or helping to remove illness by making them offerings, conducting rituals, getting more in harmony, a bit like that Christian Science idea that the more distant you are from God, the more your health will suffer for it, and therefore, conversely, the closer you get to God, the better your health becomes. So in a pagan context, Are there deities which, if you are in harmony with them, your health gets better, but if you are in discord with them because you've done something, whatever it is, to create problems and barriers, then your health, mental or physical or both, starts to suffer as a consequence of that? That's an idea to mull over. You might decide it's complete rubbish and outdated nonsense, or you might decide that there is some validity to that idea and concept, and that it has to be thought of and integrated. Given that many of the beings we're talking about are seen as forces within the environment, again, environmental health is a strong idea these days, that if you live somewhere where it's really noisy and polluted and the neighbours are always screaming and shouting and arguing and you're worried about going out at night in case you get mugged because it's a really rough neighbourhood, if you're surrounded by hostile environmental forces, your mental health and your physical health will deteriorate. Whereas if you live in a pleasant, relaxing, positive, nice environment, you've got a good network of friends and you feel safe, you can wander the streets without worrying that someone's going to do you in. It doesn't absolutely protect you from all illness, but your health, generally speaking, your mental health and physical health, gets better and is stronger. And if you do get unwell, then you're more likely to recover from it because you've got that lovely environment and that supportive network of friendly people around you. And those friendly forces, as we know from all sorts of things done where they take dogs into nursing homes and hospices and things like that, can include the non-human. The pets, animals, various different creatures can have a beneficial effect on human health, just as rats and fleas and things can have a very negative effect on human health. And if we can accept that, is it such a stretch to suggest that that can include the supernatural forces which are neither human nor cats and dogs and horses and what have you, but of a different order again? Something for you to reflect on and think about and decide for yourself there. I think that's probably more than enough. I've been waffling for very nearly an hour, so I'll leave that one there. And if anyone's got any questions, if you do ask, and I can add to it or clarify points I've not explained clearly.